Hello, hello. It's the Japan Zoominar from UC San Diego. It is March 31st, 4 p.m. in California, which makes it April 1st, 8 a.m. in Japan. Ohayo gozaimasu, and welcome, audience. I'm Ulrike Schade, professor, director of the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology here at UC San Diego. And today's topic, of course, is Japan's Zelenskyy shock. And my guest is Yuji Itomoto. We're expecting a full house today, while the audience is still finding their seats, let me tell you a little bit about us. This finds you at GPS, the School of Global Policy and Strategy, where we have 46 and counting faculty. I have the great joy of announcing that we have hired a Japan economist who will join our faculty in the fall, and I'll introduce Kikuchi-san to you at that time. In addition to the faculty, we have research centers and degrees, including a Master of International Affairs with a Japan specialization. If you're interested in our offerings, please go to gps.ucsd.edu. And JFIT is our Japan Center. We do a lot of fun things. You can find us at jfit.ucsd.edu. And that is also the website where our library is. So our events are recorded. And there are two implications of that. It means that we have a gallery, the JZ Gallery, which is our library of past events. You can find it at jfit.ucsd.edu/Zoomina. It looks like the screenshot there. For today's event, like all of our events, feel free to type any questions you may have for our speaker or for both of us in the Q&A box. I've changed the policy a little bit. In the old days, I used to call people by names, but let's switch that. And I will not refer to you by your name, even only your first name, unless you type into the question something like ID me or hey, I'm Joey or something, and then I will just read that out. So it's your choice whether you want your name known or not. Okay, so one more thing in announcements. Our next Zoominar will be on April 29th, which is a Tuesday, and I'll have Professor Jennifer Weisenfeld from Duke. Jennifer is a distinguished professor of art and art history, and she has a brand new book about the fine art of persuasion, corporate advertising, design in modern Japan. She's a historian, right? And so we're going back in time. You might think that's far removed from what we're doing today, but actually not so much. Jennifer's previous book was called Gas Mask Nation, which was about exercises and readiness and preparedness during or living up to, sort of World War II. So there is a connection there. So mark your calendars, April 29th. All right, so I've got Yuji Itomoto here. Enough of me. Let me introduce him. Hey, Yuji.
Hello, great to be here.
Yes, great to have you. So Yuji Itomoto is a postdoctoral scholar here at GPS, and it's my great joy to introduce you to our community. We've been waiting for a time, and then this Zelenskyy shock presented itself, so it's perfect to have you. Yuji earned his degrees in Japan and England and the United States. He's a triple country international relations and security scholar. He earned his BA in Tsukuba, an MA in International Studies, University of Birmingham, and then also a master at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He has an MA from Georgetown. Is that right? From George Washington.
George Washington,
right,
yeah.
Right, my apologies. And a PhD from the University of Southern California. Go Trojans. He works on, his PhD thesis was on East Asia security, including Japan defense matters, and his dissertation is on the China threat for East Asia. In between all of those degrees, Yuji worked for 9 years at Japan's Ministry of Defense, including in the Defense Planning Division and the Strategic Intelligence Division. So he was for 9 years a career defense strategy person. And your time there, Yuji, I understand, included 2 years as assistant director at the cabinet secretary. So in the Kante, the national security section. So Yuji, you're perfectly positioned to help us understand how Japan is reading the tea leaves, maybe, or how maybe Japan wants to read the tea leaves of what's going on in the United States. So thank you for joining me.
All right, thank you very much. So let me share the screen. Okay.
That's looking great.
Great. All right. So is it?
Now start the
Great.
show, maybe.
Great. Yeah.
Super.
All right, great. Thank you very much for the invite, and it's great to be here. So the Japan's Zelenskyy shock. So I'm gonna start my initial remark with quick overview of what happened. Right. So President Trump and Zelenskyy met on February 28th at the White House. And on that meeting, President Trump and Vice President Vance accused Zelenskyy of not thanking enough for the US support to Ukraine. And they also accused Zelenskyy of gambling millions of lives of Ukrainian people by his insistence that Ukraine should continue to fight. So that meeting ended in disaster with no clear agreement, no resolutions, no joint press conference. They just walked away. And immediately after that, the US stopped military assistance to Ukraine, including the procurement of weapons and intelligence sharing. Although those military assistance later resumed, the shock was quite huge for Ukraine and beyond. So naturally, that U.S. Action toward Ukraine caused a lot of widespread concerns among policymakers, scholars, and experts, especially the U.S. allies in Asia and Europe. And naturally, it caused uncertainty about the reliability of the U.S. alliance, like the way that U.S. behaved toward Ukraine. They naturally kind of caused some anxiety that maybe US might do the same in case of like war or like some contingency happening in Asia or other Europe. And to make matters worse, after the meeting, President Trump criticized US-Japan alliance as one-sided, meaning that, well, the US has to protect Japan, but Japan doesn't have to protect the US. That's unfair, it's one-sided. That's the long-held Trump's kind of criticism of the US-Japan alliance. And also when talking about the new developing the fighter jet F-47, President Trump mentioned that if and when those fighter jets are sold to US allies, those fighter jets should be deliberately downgraded by 10%, which is not clear what that means, but they should be downgraded anyway for somehow. Because he said someday those US allies, maybe they are not our allies in the future. So those remarks and those actions by Trump administration cause a lot of uncertainty about the reliability of the US alliance, including Japan. And Japan's official response so far is quite restrained. So the March 4th is after this meeting and after the US stopped military assistance to Ukraine. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs says that all parties involved must work together to achieve a fair and lasting peace in Ukraine. So this is basically the repetition of the same line. This is since like January or February. So suggesting that there's no like official change of the policy, Japanese policy toward Ukraine or toward the US. And on the same day, the Minister of Defense also expressed that Japanese government places full trust in the United States fulfilling its obligations under the US-Japan security treaties. So all those remarks suggest that, at least officially, Japan is saying that everything is under control, nothing to worry about. The US is still committed to the defense of Japan and other allies. But even so, like, there are a lot of experts, scholars, and some policymakers in Japan speculate and even predicted that maybe drastic changes in defense policy coming in Japan. It is because if the US cannot be reliable as an ally, Japan might have to consider some drastic policy changes, such as developing their own nuclear weapons, or further increasing the defense spending to to strengthen their capabilities, just in case that the U.S. does not come to support for Japan in case of war or something. So I agree with that. I agree that those kind of concerns are there in Japan, and a lot of policymakers and experts are actually seriously discussing these kind of possibilities. With that said, my take at this moment is that those drastic changes in Japan's defense policies remain unlikely. It's a low possibility to materialize. I'm not making that like deterministic argument that it's never gonna happen, but I think that the possibility remains quite low. So let me explain the reasons. So since I want to make this initial remark short, so I just want to go over just two reasons. So first is that there are political and financial constraints. Japan is currently implementing the national security strategy, which was published back in 2022, which says that Japan would increase the defense and related spending to 2% of the GDP. But in order to achieve that spending goal, Japan needs to implement some taxes. But part of the taxes has not been even implemented yet. I'm not sure when to implement, because there are still a lot of strong domestic opposition to implementing the taxes to increase the defense spending. So it's still Japan struggling to increase to achieving the goal of defense spending. So it's tantamount to political suicide is to say that, yeah, Japan should increase the defense spending even more. Because that raises the immediate question of, okay, but how we can finance that? Because we have already kind of struggling to achieve the 2% of the GDP goal. So how can we achieve that? So that kind of that political situation is not great for the initiation of such a drastic political change, policy change in terms of defense spending. Also, Japan is holding an upper house election in July, so now is not time to initiate or even suggest some like politically unpopular policy like increasing the defense spending further, or even like let alone the nuclearization or even possibility of like nuclearization. And even after the election this year, and even if the LDP maintains a majority in the upper house, the LDP still doesn't have a majority in the lower house, which makes it very difficult for the LDP to initiate or let alone implement some drastic changes, such as further increasing the defense spending. And also there are a lot of domestic and international hurdles to clear for developing nuclear weapons. Domestically, without saying, there are still like anti-nuclear kind of sentiment is strong in Japan. Internationally, there's Japan's suggestion of like nuclearization immediately and almost certainly raise tensions with China, North Korea, and possibly with other Asian states as well. So there are a lot of domestic and international hurdles for Japan to implement or even initiate those drastic changes. And the second is that it's a difference between Japan and Ukraine, right? So Japan is a treaty ally with the US, hosting around 55,000 US military personnel. And meanwhile, Ukraine is not a treaty ally with the US, and also they don't host the US bases or official military personnel. So it's a lot more difficult for the US to just say that, okay, we're gonna stop military assistance, we're gonna remove those military support from Japan. Because it's more difficult to just move around those 55,000 people and let down those equipment, the US bases kind of stuff. So it's just that the situation is a little bit difficult. It's physically it's difficult for the US to just stop military assistance, just like it did to the Ukraine. And also abrogating the US-Japan security treaty or even just threat to abrogate the treaty will be unlikely even for the Trump administration, because there are a lot of China hawks in the Trump administration right now, like Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor, and John Ratcliffe, the director of the CIA, and Elbridge Colby, the Undersecretary of Defense nominee. They are all China hawks that argue that China is a national security threat to the US and consider that US-Japan alliance as a valuable asset to counter China. So those abrogating or threat to abrogate or ruining those assets would be really directly opposite to what the Trump administration is trying to do. And also just to threatening to abrogate or like just signaling that US is unreliable allies for the Asian states might precipitate the Asian states to lean toward China. Because East Asian states such as like Vietnam, Indonesia, or Malaysia, or Singapore, they are currently hedging, just trying to make a good relation with China and also the US, because they want to maintain a good and profitable economic and diplomatic relations with China, but at the same time with the US, because the US can provide some security guarantee. But if US turns out to be unreliable partner and unlikely to provide that security guarantee, then the agencies may calculate that, okay, that's not, it doesn't pay just to try to maintain a good relationship with the US, and it's maybe more profitable, maybe more easier for them to maintain security, just to lean more toward China and just going around China's orbit. And that would increase China's influence in Asia to the extent that could be detrimental to US economic and diplomatic interest. So to undergird the US kind of emphasis of the importance of Asia, the Secretary of Defense Hex's visit to Asia just last week. Last week, the Hexes met the defense minister in the Philippines, and he said that our ironclad alliance has never been stronger. And he also pledged that the US would deploy more advanced US capabilities in the Philippines. So the US is more like signaling that it's doubling down on the US alliance with the Philippines. And similar message to Japan as well. When Hexes met Prime Minister Ishiba and also Defense Minister Nakatani, the Hexes says that Japan is an indispensable partner in deterring communist Chinese military aggressions, and also says that the US would reorganize USFJ headquarters with increased staff and the empowerment of the USFJ commander with the authority necessary to implement the change. So those actions and remarks signals that Trump administrations are willing to and doubling down on maintaining and committed to those US allies in Asia. So the situation is quite contrast to the US policy toward Ukraine or to the extent that Europe. Well, this is mainly two reasons. I think the things likely to come for now is that Japan will keep doing what they have been doing. Like Japan will keep strengthening its own defense capabilities and also strengthening its ties with the US and with other partners according to the current national security strategy. But one caveat is that Japan may have to try to show the US that it is sharing a fair burden of defense by, for example, buying more US weapons to placate the US to some extent, and also increasing the host nation support for the USFJ, meaning that Japan should pay more to help the cost of US military stationing in Japan. So I can imagine that some little bit of Japan's effort to placate and maintain a good relationship with the US, but I think those drastic changes like in defense policy, like nuclearization or dramatic increase of the defense spending is, at least at the moment, it remains unlikely. I stop here and I look forward to the discussion. Oh, Ulrike, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you. So very interesting. Thank you for a great introduction. So it seems to me that one of the challenges here is that everything is so unpredictable. And what you're saying, so if you look at the various news outlets, there's a piece in the Financial Times, op-ed piece that said, well, Japan is on red alert. Then there was Brett Glasserman, who we had here a couple of weeks ago, and he wrote an op-ed piece in the Japan Times comparing the situation like watching a duck in a pond where the duck goes, and it looks all good, but if you were to look under the water level, there's a whole lot of paddling going on that you don't see unless you look very carefully. And so Brad is thinking that there's a whole lot of paddling going on in Asia, not just in Tokyo, right now to figure out what on earth to do if if these flip-flops continue, right? I mean, that's the biggest problem. How do you make strategy if you don't know what your alliance partner is going to do next or on a whim? I mean, what do you think is sort of the sentiment in Tokyo right now about that?
Well, I think it's sure there is a lot of uncertainty about the second administration. I think that I talked to some of those, the officials, like, and about this kind of situation going on myself, and it's mixed feeling. Like it's a lot of concerns about unpredictabilities about those Trump administrations. But also they see some kind of consistency in Trump's administrations, like, and it's just the Trump is administration, like in the first time as well, just consistently see China as a more like threat to the US. And to counter that threat, is the US is put more emphasis on like Asian allies, more importance on Asian allies than allies in Europe. Because Russia is more like a lesser extent of a threat to US, and China is more primary threat. So to counter that threat, US, of course, Japan and Taiwan, South Korea needs the US, but US also needs those allies to counter that threat. So in that case, although there are a lot of uncertainty about the second administrations, but at the same time, there's some consistency that, or some kind of underlying belief that the US needs those allies in Asia. So the US eventually, ultimately, wouldn't do anything that it jeopardizes those alliance relations to pieces.
So, so we're getting questions in, which is great, and two folks have asked a question that I actually have on my list here too. So you make a point that the paddling under, or the all the motion underneath the water is actually not that busy because of the financial constraints and the fact that funding this sort of thing would be unpopular. I think that kind of resistance would go away. I mean, history tells us that the political sort of, the voters' perspective on whether it's too expensive or not goes away pretty soon when there's a threat. But you suggest that Japan might want to pay more for the alliance, and that seems to be a politically super volatile topic, right? And then you mentioned, well, if Japan were to do something, would, maybe it would have to build its own nuclear weapons. And the question there is, if Japan were to decide to do that, how quickly could it?
Right. So if Japan, try to develop nuclear weapons, I'm not the tech expert, so I cannot say for sure and with confidence, but the expert agrees that Japan can do it relatively quickly, like in a few years span, like I mean that's the
I'm sorry, did you
estimate
say
varies.
a few years?
Yeah, a few years. Yeah, that estimate like a few years to. It's that the estimate varies. So like the quickest one is like a few years, and the longest one is like 10 years. So I'm not sure that if actually Japan's really doubling down on the developing nuclear weapons, but it wouldn't be technically that difficult.
I've heard, we have Admiral Thomas on our faculty here.
Yeah, I think he can say more about that stuff.
He would say weeks.
with or
Okay, so we don't know.
yeah, it's I think that it's more, it's a technical kind of hurdle is much a bit lower than more political hurdles. Like it just we have to change the official policy, and also we have to find a place to store the nuclear weapons. That's not a trivial matter, right? It's because even like in those missile defense system, like Aegis Ashore, like back in like 2020, Japan tried to deploy some Aegis missile defense system either in Akita Prefecture or Yamaguchi Prefecture. Even just that's relatively benign kind of weapon, just defensive weapon. There are a lot of local backlashes. No, not our our backyard kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So
So I hear that usually, and we're getting kind of pushback also from the audience. If we're talking about a scenario where the United States says, okay, we're no longer defending Japan. Right? And then the question is, okay, how long would it take for Japan to really get busy? And um, what's the would really the people of Akita have a saying and no, you can't put it here? I mean, first of all, there are not that many people there. I mean, this is the whole depopulation, and and so how difficult would that really be? I mean, I think I'm a little bit more negative on this than you are. You seem to think that Japan still has a very strong domestic political anti-sentiment against this, but isn't that exactly the point of this whole Zelenskyy shock? That the shock is that we may not have the security that we think we have, kind of thing.
right, it's so I'm not sure that how long it might take, but it's if the Trump says that okay, we're not gonna protect Japan, we're gonna abrogate the treaty, so that means that it's I think that will initiate a discussion like okay, so if really Trump said that, if they're trying to implement that, it's caused a lot of it's discussion I can easily imagine. And if that really happens, then like I think those hurdles can be overcome. Like just Japan is really the US is really kind of start kind of removing this personnel to from Japan, and it takes time, but it's it's that gradual kind of movement, right? So
Okay.
so like in that kind of costly signal that happens, then like I can imagine that this political hurdle of like maybe nuclearization or defense spending kind of increase. I think that could be overcome, but without that kind of actually clear signal from the US, that it's difficult for Japan to initiate those kind of its policy. So that's my point.
So we have a question that actually it was already posted twice. So this is really a high burner question for you as a political scientist and having worked in the government. By what path could Japan politically decide to develop nuclear weapons? So what would have to happen? Under what circumstances could Japan find a path to a decision to do this? So basically, what are we watching for here?
Yeah, so I think if Japan decided to develop or its nuclear weapons, first they have, Japan at the moment have like official policy of like a non-nuclear policy, like they would not develop, they would not possess, they would not like let other states bring that nuclear weapon to Japan. So those kind of official nuclear policy. So first, Japan needs to abrogate those policies, and at the same time, Japan needs to withdraw from non-proliferation treaty, the NPT treaties. So just because Japan is the signatory of that treaty, so Japan needs to do that. That itself caused a lot of backlashes because that could on the status of like a pariah state could be like North Korea does or Iran or to that matter. That's also already kind of big decision. And then we just talk about just technical whether we should develop the nuclear weapon our own, or we should buy the nuclear weapon from the US, because the US might be open to selling the nuclear weapon if they don't protect Japan. Yeah, just we don't protect Japan, we can just we can just sell nuclear weapon to Japan to for Japan to be able to defend ourselves. And that's something that Trump actually said, like, I'm not sure when, but it's like a few months ago, maybe. So
It
yeah,
probably doesn't matter. It probably doesn't matter what was said a few months ago, right? But
yeah, that's true.
the question is, what's domestically the political path? So, so we're watching the news, we're reading the news. Do you think there would be any pointers where you read something in the news where you say, okay, now that's a different thing, or how could the politicians sort of create this path domestically?
I think it's a government need to change as I said, the non-nuclear policy. Well, that's the government official policy. So if Japan start discussing and contemplating those, developing nuclear weapons, the first step is just to change or just uh, abrogate all those non-nuclear policy. So if the diet or government start talking about this non-nuclear policy, as changing non-nuclear policy, that's one clear sign of maybe Japan is stepping towards actually seriously contemplating either developing or buying the nuclear weapon. So I think that's one clear signal from Japan about this nuclearization.
So we have somebody who understands the technology, and I stand corrected, and maybe you also, but it is said that not weeks, definitely not weeks, maybe month, maybe years. I don't think Japan is interested in us knowing exactly how long it would take. But we have
Strategic
a
ambiguity.
question on something that's close to your next research project, actually, Yuji, and that is in the case that things go bad, the U.S. abandons the alliance relationship. So think about worst case scenario kind of thing. What do you think are the chances for Article 9 to be changed, the Article 9 of the Constitution, right? Changed in a speedily, in a speedy fashion. I mean, would that be a trigger?
I mean, so if some drastic change happened, like the Trump actually says that they're gonna abrogate the security treaty or they're gonna just removing those U.S. personnel, I think that precipitates the Japanese government to seriously contemplating the constitutional change. But I think that is more like long-term goal. I think that it's immediate thing that the Japan needs to do is just to strengthen its capabilities to defend ourselves without U.S. support. And constitutional change might help, but just it's the nuclearizations or increase in defense spending, the constitution does not prohibit that. Because under the Japanese official kind of interpretation of the constitution is that the constitution does not prohibit Japan's nuclearization. As long as we think that the nuclear weapon is a necessary means means to defend ourselves, then the nuclearization is constitutional. That's the official kind of position for long term for a long time. So I think it's constitutional change may not be the priority for Japan. Of course, that will be a long-term goal, and it's long-term beneficial for Japan to operate normally. But I think the immediate concern for Japan is like just whether they should have nuclear weapons or they should increase the defense spending to get more like weapons or some increase the capabilities. So I think in that kind of drastic change, like U.S. removing withdrawing from Japan, is more like constitutional changes. I think it's secondary kind of priority, I think.
All right. So we have tons of questions. Hiroki, our colleague, who wanted to make sure that you know that he's asking this, actually has two questions for us. The first is about the U.S. actually. So after the Trump-Zelenskyy meeting, as you introduced, Ishiba clearly said Ukraine is the victim and Russia is the aggressor. Now that the Trump administration seems to disagree with that, how much does this position bother the United States? I mean, is that even a thing? And then the other question is also on your slide number 5 or so. He wants to know whether it's actually probably easier to increase the defense budget than to develop nuclear weapons. So would that not be the path? that you go to the people and say, well, we're not going to do nuclear weapons, but we're going to increase the spending?
Right. Okay. I'm going to answer to the second question first, and I can imagine that more like incremental increase in defense spending is likely. First, the Japan will prioritize achieving the 2% of the defense GDP goal, like first by 2027. And after that, I think it's I can easily imagine that Japan try to increase defense spending bit by bit, not like drastic like 3% or 5% change, but I think more incremental change is more feasible because now that those 1% come GDP barriers is gone, so I think Japan is more it's more politically feasible to incrementally increase the defense spending. So I think that possibility is entirely feasible, but not like drastic kind of change like from jumping to from next year to 3% or 5%. So I think that's entirely possible. And the first question is that I didn't entirely get the first question is that so it's the US it said that Ukraine is not the victim but just the Russia.
Yeah,
What's
so is it because Ishiba took a position on Ukraine, right? So very clear.
Yeah.
And is that the problem,
For
or
the US? For the US
yeah,
or
from the U.S. perspective? I mean, so we're sitting here, right? We're watching all what is actually the problem? Is the problem that Japan is taking sides, or Japan's political positions, or is the problem that just the United States just wants to renegotiate everything?
well, I think that it's Japan's it's has been long time regarded that Ukraine is a victim and Russia is aggressor, and that it's very difficult for Japan to just flip side like now the Trump said that the Ukraine is the aggressor. Now of course Ukraine is the aggressor. Now it's very difficult to switch that position for Japan. So I think that Japan has to say that alongside with other G7 members except for the US that the Ukraine is the victim. So the problem is more of like that. It's more like inconsistency of like the U.S. approach toward Ukraine. Like it's just it's very difficult to see because it's changing day by day. Like it's one day just Trump sided with Putin and it's like blaming the Zelenskyy as a dictator that without any kind of mandate from the people. And the other day now, right now, it's like President Trump is more towards side with the Ukraine and can be blaming the Putin for delaying those kind of ceasefire agreements. So it's that kind of inconsistency or unpredictability. I think that's the underlying cause of this concern, right? Trump is so unpredictable. We don't exactly know what he will do next. So that's the source of the concern for not only Ukraine but also European allies and also Asian allies, including Japan.
So we're having a lot of questions about the larger context, but this is not just US, Japan. And so I'm going to work my way through some of those questions. We're going to, Russia and North Korea and China, of course. And one of our senior colleagues in the field, who we both admire very much, says the following. So Trump has shown no willingness to continue longstanding security commitments. Doesn't that put Taiwan at risk? Right? With the U.S. with few official commitments to defend Taiwan, would we just give that up? And doesn't all that mean that Japan cannot comfortably sit back and say, oh, let's give the United States some money for the 55,000 troops? I mean, this is not in a vacuum. There are more vectors flying around. How would you start on the Taiwan and China part, and then we move to the other players?
Right. So I think it's in Taiwan. The Trump's policy toward Taiwan it's more a bit worrying, right? Because it's not like it's official security treaty alliance that the U.S. and Taiwan is. So it's a bit more easier for the U.S. to say that we're not gonna to defend Taiwan because in the first place we are not at least treaty wise they are not obligated to. But I think that's also like concern for Japan because it's if they can actual war happened between China and Taiwan, Japan cannot be, just isolate themselves, cannot isolate themselves from that war. It could some attack on like Okinawa or like some other islands and kind of stuff. And so it's that Taiwan issue is more concerned like it for Japan. Like it's, but my take is that as long as the the U.S. bases, the U.S. personnel in Okinawa, that that's and if as China attack Taiwan, that in that cause attack also Okinawa and kind of stuff, then U.S. personnel would die, right? And that could work as a tripwire. It's like you say, if that happens, like it means that okay, that China attacked Taiwan under the watch of Trump, and the U.S. personnel died under the watch of Trump in Japan. And if Trump or U.S. didn't do anything about that, what does that leave Trump? It could make him look weak. Like if that means if not only Trump failed to deter China from Taiwan, but also it didn't do anything to just in case of like a U.S. personnel death by the direct attack of China. So I think in that sense, I think it's as long as the U.S. bases are stationing in Okinawa, I think that the U.S. it's very difficult for the U.S. to say that yeah, we are not going to be involved. Like, so I think that it could be a kind of work as a kind of deterrent for to some extent for China to contemplate attacking Taiwan and attacking Okinawa.
So we're going back into Japan, but this what you just said triggered a question by our longstanding colleague Mark, whose work at the Congressional Research Service I've long admired. Mark's question is, what do you think the impact on Japanese thinking would be if the United States withdrew some or all of its troops from South Korea, or decided not to uphold the U.S.-Philippines Treaty in case of a Philippines-China military crash? That is to say, what would Japan do if we saw in other places that the U.S. is really as unreliable as it now seems to be?
Of course, it depends on the situation, the reason why U.S. the U.S. troops withdraw from the South Korea or Philippines. But I think I can easily imagine that that those kind of U.S. move toward Korea or Philippines can generate a feeling that maybe we could be next, right? So I think that can clear move like a removal of U.S. troops from Korea or the Philippines. I think that would galvanize the Japanese policymakers to do something. Either to, I think at first at least try to maintain that that prevent that U.S. troop from withdrawing from Japan. I think that the Japan's first attempt, but I think in that case Japan also would seriously considering so what they would do, and actually if the U.S. troops from Japan start withdrawing. I think that precipitates the serious discussion of like both nuclearization and also dramatic increase of defense spending or other measures to ensure the Japan security. So I think I agree that I think those U.S. Removal from South Korea or Philippines would give quite a shock to Japan, maybe possibly more than Zelenskyy shock.
So there's more on Korea. I mean, the very first question that we got while you were even still talking was, what is your view on the DPRK-RU military cooperation?
DPRK and ROK?
North Korea and Russia.
Korea and Russia, okay. I think that's a war. I mean, it's definitely worrying kind of development of the situation, right? Just it's North Korea sending some troops to Ukraine, and in exchange for that, it's according to some news sources that Russia is providing some technological assistance to the nuclear development of North Korea, right? And also the nuclear and missile development. And with that help, then maybe North Korea can develop more advanced missile and maybe more like, small size nuclear weapons as well. So I think that's worrying kind of development for Japan, and that's it's concern. Not maybe as drastic or shocking as like Zelenskyy shock or like a U.S. military removal from Korea or Philippines, but I think that's a worrying development for sure.
So, it's great how these questions come together. So, one of our audience writes this. I just read this morning in a Kyoto report, I hadn't seen it, that the Chinese leadership has proposed the PRC, Japan, South Korea talks on North Korean denuclearization. And some of this has already, happened several, I mean, there's been some talks, right? But what does this tell us about the PRC leadership in terms of taking the possibility of Japanese or South Korean nuclearization seriously? And does the politics look different from inside Japan than outside on this? So what is China's position here? What does China think about North Korea at this point?
Well, I think that it's China's policy toward North Korea. It's consistent, like in the sense that just China doesn't want North Korea to collapse because that's a lot of political kind of uncertainty happens, and what happened to the nuclear weapons in North Korea, and it could be a lot of refugees kind of flowing into China, and that also caused domestic kind of unrest in China as well. So I think that China's policy is toward North Korea is just they don't want it to collapse, but they don't want it to nuclearize themselves. But I think that policy is consistent. But I think that it's really interesting development is that those kind of cooperation between this, China, South Korea, and Japan has been developing. Not only just denuclearization of North Korea, but also like those how to deal with this rise of the protectionism right now. I think a few days ago, those the ministers of trade of China, Japan, and South Korea met together and just to discuss how to deal with those kind of rise of protectionism. They didn't mention that the Trump, like they didn't name that, but I think I think everyone knows that and what those meetings are about. So I think that's kind of one of my points, that if the U.S. pushes too much on Asian allies, and those Asian states might go to those to get more closer to China. So I think there's a limit that Trump can do to try to push a hard bargain against those Asian allies and partners. I think that's one evidence that this. If pushed by U.S., maybe those Asian states may go to China just instead.
Yeah, I mean the business connection comes in here, right? And I've been thinking about this for a while, that there is actually an equilibrium in the global value chains that are focused on Northeast Asia, right? And so, and these dependencies are, maybe people don't like them much, but they're there and they're actually profitable. So if the United States were to and this is actually a question from one of our colleagues, right? So if the United States were to just change its view on all of these FDAs and all of these trade agreements and everything that's actually been very stabilizing in the region, and then politics come in, Takaichi and the right wing want to get Ishiba and lose the election, right? What will Japan value more, our colleague asks, militarism or the commitment of the US-Japan bilateral alliance? Multilateralism or the commitment to the US-Japan alliance?
So I think it depends on the reliability of the U.S. Like it's definitely that the U.S.-Japan alliances rather than just multilateralism. Although Japan says that it's both important, but if they have to choose, like I think Japan is more like the cornerstone of the security of Japan is still the U.S.-Japan alliances. But as we get discussed for for the past hour, just if Trump actually start withdrawing like some U.S. troops from like South Korea or Philippines or even from Japan, then I think that has to change, right? So, but I think that at this moment, I think the cornerstone of the security of Japan is definitely the U.S.-Japan alliances. No other multilateralism can substitute for that. And so I think that's shared by most of the experts in Japan, I think.
Yeah, but that's why there's the Zelenskyy shock, right?
Yeah, yeah,
If that were not true, then this event would not have been so shocking. And so that's sort of
yeah.
the that's really the pickle, if that's too not strong enough a word. So um uh what worries you most, Yuji? I mean, you've been following this for, and as an insider and then as a PhD student and so forth, and now you write about Japan and you have a new project on Article 9 and the domestic politics about that. What what is sort of, and we don't want to end on this sort of worst case scenario, so then I will later on ask you why you think things may turn out just fine after all. But let's start with what is sort of the disaster scenario? What's the worst thing that that keeps you awake at night right now?
Right. So I think that's as shocking as Zelensky shock is, but I think that is not shocking enough for Japan to precipitate more like the drastic changes. But what I worry about most is that although I think that it is U.S. interest to maintain the alliance system in the Asia, and I think most of those senior colleagues in the Trump administration knows that. So but against all the odds, if Trump says that yeah, we're not gonna defend Japan, we start withdrawing those troops and like either in Japan or South Korea, Philippines, that's actually worries about most. It's against all those U.S. interest and also Japan's interest and also Asia's interest. But if that happens, then Japan and also other East Asian states has to take some actions like one way or another, either nuclearization or either doing or like a dramatic increase in defense spending, causing some kind of arms race in Asia, or like maybe like just bandwagoning China, just then we just can create some of China's kind of hegemony in Asia. So that's in the U.S. It's against all odds. Just if Trump says those kind of stuff, again, just yeah, abrogate treaty, removing the personnel. That worries me the most.
So we actually do have a question from our colleague.
Mm.
It says, "What the I guess that's their worst case scenario. What if Trump or the Trump administration were to say Japan has rewritten the United States provision of security and has exploited us for a long time. So if Japan is attacked by North Korea, that's a punishment to Japan." What would
Yeah, I
you
mean that.
say?
That's also close to my own like worst case scenario. Like, and that tantamount to say that the kind of just obligation was this treaty or this treaty into commitment, right? So if and just he tweeted on the X or Twitter or like just saying that that's also like kind of cause a lot of yeah, like it's kind of a domino effect, and then like one thing led to another, and I think that's could cause an arms race or like or like establishment of a Chinese hegemony or like that. So I'm
But
quite worried
Japan
about
is
that.
not a lame duck, right? I mean, the Japan's military is what, the fifth largest in the world?
It's spending wise more like closer to 10. No, now it's like a fifth or fourth years.
Yeah, and then in number of troops, the Japan beats punches, above its sort of size, per capita population and so forth and so on. So Japan is
Yeah.
not just sitting there waiting to be attacked, right? That's not the reality. So um, maybe that gets us to the positive question. I don't know, but I mean, I don't know how likely these scenarios are. We just don't know. But I just can't believe that Japan is sitting there twiddling its thumbs and waiting for the good people of whatever prefecture it is to allow to store weapons, or the government to spend money on defense, given the increasing uncertainty. I just that doesn't rhyme with my view. There must, I mean, the red alert or the duck without paddling seem to me to be, to depictions of the situation. So let's end on a positive note. So why what is the what do you hope for?
So I make 2 points. Like first, that I actually reiterate my point that the Trump administration is quite unlikely to just say like abrogate the U.S. and Japan treaty or like any other Asian treaties, because it's based on his appointment of like those China hawks like Mark Rubio, Mike Waltz, Elbridge Colby, those kind of stuff. If Trump does not share the belief that China is a threat to U.S. national security, he didn't have appointed all those China hawks. So I believe that Trump also shared those kind of, the perception that China is a threat, and to counter that China threat, the U.S. needs those alliances in Asia. So my kind of first positive kind of conclusion is that it's quite unlikely that Trump administration go as far as saying that, yeah, we're not gonna protect Japan or South Korea or Philippines. And the second is a positive kind of, point is that I agree with you, Ulrike Sensei, that Japan is not a kind of lame duck. Japan not well, geographically small, but it's quite a capable country economically and militarily, and Japan can do a lot by himself, and especially if they are forced to do, like So, and also like geography wise, that's those amphibious kind of invasions, very difficult for China to do that. So I think that that's one difference between like Asia and Europe, right? That Russia can share the land border with Ukraine or other Baltic countries, or that's made it easy for Russia to project power over them, but it's not the same in Asia and China. So even if the US is kind of reduce the commitment to the Japan or like an Asian allies, but still it's difficult for like China or any other states to like willfully invade other countries. So that's still like a lot the Japan and the other states can do a lot just to make sure that they can defend and deter any aggressions. So
And
that's a 2 point.
and I'll throw in the business angle, right? So China is making a lot of electric vehicles now, but it couldn't do so without input materials and input machinery from Japan and South Korea. And you don't want to invade a country that you need for your economic goal, right? And that's a very different situation, I think, as you said, in Europe, because those trade connections are very different and of a different nature, I think. Oh, well. Okay, so we're hoping that things will stay stable, and Japan is not underarmed, and and as our former colleague, I don't think he's on the call, but Ellis Krauss always used to say Japan is not a pacifist country, because if it were a pacifist country, it wouldn't have a military at all. And Japan does have a military, and but we don't want. I think none of us wants to know how strong it really is ever. So let's hope that your good scenario, prevails. So audience, thank you for joining us today. The hour is over and it happened in no time. Join us in 4 weeks from now with Jennifer Weisenfeld on art history and marketing in Japan. So a very different topic. Thank you, Yuji Hiromoto, for joining us today. It was great. And thank you, audience, for being with us. And with that, goodbye.